We are reviewing the Pasig requirements for bicycle parking. Actually, in Pasig has a local ordinance that requires all buildings to have bicycle parking. But one thing which we want to work on, which we had been working on pre-ECQ, is rolling out implementing rules and regulations that specify a compliance requirement. You can't just put up, one rusty bike rack in a shopping mall and say that you've complied. We want to make sure that whenever you have a development in Pasig, that a percentage of the built parking space is made available as parking space for bikes.
Hello, welcome to the Cycling Matters podcast, your weekly dose of discussions about our love for bike.
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 Bike. For bike.
Yes.
Bike.
This podcast is brought to you in cooperation with Ciclo. Hello, I'm Karen.
I'm Jan.
I'm King.
I'm Brian.
Okay. So in this episode of the Cycling Matters podcast, we're going to be talking to Anton Siy, one of the millennials who's working very hard to create a more effective and equitable transport policies in Pasig City. So we'll be framing our discussion within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, given the recent further extension of the community quarantine on Metro Manila and other high-risk provinces. So we'll be talking about cycling before, during, and beyond the pandemic. So if you haven't yet, do subscribe to the Cycling Matters podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you can really find podcasts. So just search Cycling Matters in your favorite podcast platform, put on some earphones, and enjoy the discussion. And we'll be posting, putting a pinned comment, which is like, you can, if you have questions for Anton about like how things will be like cycling urban wise, particularly Pasig or in general. So we really encourage you to leave a comment on our Facebook Live. Okay, Jan, take it away.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, Rob. Anton. Sorry. Yeah, Anton. Hi, Anton. Yeah. So thanks. Thank you so much for joining us in the podcast. Finally, we get to speak with you with all of our and ask you all of our questions. And also get to know more about you. And I know you've started to build a following. I noticed like you.
Wow.
Parang nagkaroon ng time na you had to create a Twitter account because someone made a fake account or something.
I don't know about that. I think I think maybe the only reason I have anything resembling a following is because my boss retweeted me with the AR panda from Google Filters. So
Right, I remember.
that was a little fun, but it is quite nice to to get online. Like you said, it's a millennial thing to have conversations about the stuff you love with people from all around, and it's just one of the wonders of the internet, even at a time like this.
Yeah, and I enjoy very much all the tweets you've been posting in the past few weeks.
Yeah, me too.
For those who aren't aware, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers and our listeners who'll be with us right now, and those who'll be listening to this episode on Spotify and our other platforms.
All right, sige. I guess relevant to this podcast. Hello, my name is Robert Anthony Siy. You can call me Anton. I work for the City Transportation Development and Management Office in Pasig City. It's a long name, but we brand ourselves Pasig Transport because we handle basically transport planning for the city of Pasig. Now, the stuff that we work on basically comes down to improving modes of sustainable transportation for the cities. So we're really focused on walking, cycling, and public transport. So we operate alongside the city's traffic enforcement and traffic management office to try and get everyone a better mobility experience in Pasig and ultimately build a better city. But I think we are in a way unique among local government units in Metro Manila, and I think even all over the Philippines, for having a unit dedicated to really working on sustainable transport. So it's been something Pasig City has had. Our office has been in Pasig City active since 2017, and we're very happy that our work continues, and our work definitely remains quite important in the time of COVID-19.
So it's only been 3 years yung ano ng Pasig Transport.
Actually, yeah. I mean, Pasig's had a traffic and parking management office for a much longer time than that. But then, really formalizing all of the city's sustainable transport initiatives into one office was only really done recently. So, in addition to working on cycling, we are also involved in trying to improve things like road safety. We also offer and operate the a free bus service that operates around Pasig. So we use the service to augment high demand routes in Pasig City. When there's things like transport disruptions, we also mobilize city vehicles. So we have something like a fleet management function also to be able to fill in travel demand gaps in the city.
That sounds like a lot of work, and I feel like you've done so much in the past 3 years. But
Well,
before we get into the details, no, could you share with us why did you decided to work for government?
Uh, well, I think for me, at least, on a personal level, working in government was something I was interested in for a long time. And I think given the stuff I was interested in, it was an inevitability from the start. I think when I got out of college, I really wanted to work on things like infrastructure and development. And soon after college, I was working for the Department of Finance. I worked on the unit that worked on things like privatizations and public-private partnerships. And this is during the time of the past administration's focus on PPPs to bring in some more innovation and private investment into infrastructure. So I think among the successes we had at the time was, for instance, for anyone who's been to Cebu, the Mactan Airport was one of the PPP projects that we worked on, and we also worked on projects like the development of PITX, the bus terminal, and lots of other projects that actually the thing about working on project finance and infrastructure is that some of the stuff that you spend months or even years on, you do a lot of technical work, you try and make it happen, but then I think part of life in infrastructure is that sometimes it just doesn't get off the ground because of I mean, like people say politics like it's a bad thing, but sometimes politics getting in the way of projects, there's like trade-offs for everything. So it was quite an interesting experience. And after that, I think after that, I decided I wanted to specialize in transport. So I applied for a scholarship to do a transport studies program through the Achieving Scholarship of the British Embassy. I studied transport economics in Leeds for a year because I really wanted to work on transportation. I thought it was something that I mean it's a problem that didn't seem close to being solved in the Philippines. So I figured, well, it looks like I'll be employable for a while if I decide to become an expert on this. So that was really the start of my professional transport journey. And soon after getting back, I came and worked for Pasig City, and it's been a great time since then.
Wow, parang dami nangyari ah. So in the gap between graduation and working for Pasig Transport, how many years yun?
Not really very long time actually. It was really I think less than a year. I did some independent work, some research, and I was actually recruited into Pasig City in 2017. At the time, I was consulting for the Environment Office, which was handling a lot of the transport projects of the city. So it's kind of interesting because I think many more cities should realize that sustainable transport does have very large environmental impacts and implications. So it does make sense to approach it with that kind of framing. But then I think after a while, Pasig City realized that you couldn't just house it under the environment department. I mean, there's a lot more that goes into it. So that's why the city ended up creating its own office.
It's cool, no, that you're mentioning that you've had experience in things like finance, planning, all the technical stuff, and then zooming in, focusing on transport. Now, could you tell us about the efforts on the part of the Pasig LGU, specifically for cycling and making it accessible or even possible,
Sure.
before the pandemic started?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big things that you want to which we were working on in Pasig, and which we will continue to work on in Pasig, is to make cycling as safe and accessible as possible for all ages and abilities. We don't want cycling in Pasig to be something that only high-level recreational cyclists can get into. In fact, what we want to achieve in Pasig is to make cycling something that empowers people that wouldn't have the option of traveling by other modes such as walking long distances or commuting on public transportation. I think the goal we have is for everyday cycling in Pasig to become easy, to become convenient, and to ultimately become a reality. So towards that, we've been working on expanding the city's network of protected bicycle lanes. We've also been working on improving things like traffic enforcement, trying to apprehension of people in bike lanes, and even doing things like improving enforcement of traffic rules like speeding and creating selective infrastructure improvements make make our roads safer and to prevent things like I guess you can call them dangerous driving behaviors. But and one of the big projects which we were working on before COVID happened was working on a large improvement to bicycle parking in Pasig. I mean, we know that for everyday cycling, it's not just about space on the road. You also need to have good end of trip facilities. So we'd also been working on placing a lot more public bike racks and revising the policies that Pasig has on requiring bicycle parking in buildings.
Cool. So no, it goes without saying that you're not the only LGU that's doing a lot of work now when it comes to cycling. There, a lot of people are like to talk about cycling initiatives, and we see some progress in other LGUs. But what do you think sets your efforts in Pasig City apart from other LGUs?
Well, I don't really think that I think in our minds we really aren't trying to compete with anyone here when it comes to trying to do better by cycling. But I like to think that with the team we have in Pasig, almost I'm very proud that most of our office that works on cycling bikes to work. So I think this is something people talk a lot about. I mean, many people say that public transportation would be a lot better if people who are in charge of making decisions didn't travel by car all the time. So I'm really proud that at least in our office, we definitely have a everyday cyclist kind of perspective. I don't know if other LGUs, if many others have this kind of perspective, but this is something which we definitely do have in Pasig. And I think one of the other things which we've been trying to impress in our work is that we don't really believe that there's much to be debated anymore when it comes to the science of cycling policy. I think by now, when you read I read a comment on Twitter about how cycling research has got to move past I think there's some parts that have become tedious already. We know that more cycling is better for cities. We know that it's better for the environment, and we know that the way you get more cycling is to maximize the road space dedicated to cyclists and provide good end of trip facilities. So there's no for us. I mean, we really don't spend too much energy on trying to prove that anymore. But it's a matter really of trying to I think translate from the academic discussion about it to selling it politically and managing community sentiments towards a real reimagining of streets.
That's an important point to make, no? That we already have so much information to convince people. We actually don't,
Yeah.
Every now and then there are new articles coming up where they're more like just like in parang emphasizing the importance of cycling.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned that you're not competitive about this, but I got curious. Has there been any chance where you had the chance to collaborate or have conversations with other LGUs to share all this information, all these data, and also deal with the fact that Pasig is, diba, you're in that part of the east that takes the brunt of so much traffic coming from Rizal and everything. How have you been working with other LGUs as well?
Yeah, we have. Actually, one of the things which we did in recent months was we started getting together for semi-regular meetings with the LGUs to our east and Rizal, the LGUs like Cainta and Taytay and Antipolo, because these LGUs are outside MMDA. And I think what we wanted to do was to have regular meetings about managing the transport issues that we all collectively deal with. One of the things we see working on transport in Pasig is that many of the people who work in Pasig live to the east. I mean, the LGUs I mentioned make up big parts of our residential communities, and we want to find ways to serve them better because it serves Pasigueños better as well. So, and we've been talking a lot with them about creating a unified and connected bike lane that crosses LGUs into the east to help people not have to deal with all the horrendous traffic coming from the east anymore. I mean, let's just call it what it is, right? So
Yeah.
we're always looking for ways to work into that and to improve on that. I think besides that, we've also done good work. I think we're also making progress in working with the MMDA, especially under COVID-19. Recently, they lent us more than 200 plastic barriers and cones, with which we're going to deploy some tactical and temporary bike lanes, which may be made permanent in the future. But we're definitely looking to roll that out in the near future as a measure to improve cycling under COVID-19 conditions.
Nice. That's good to hear. You have
Yeah,
something.
Anton, going back to an early point you made about how there really isn't it really isn't necessary anymore to kind of prove that
Yeah.
cycling is good for cities. But where, in your experience dealing with different stakeholders and shareholders and so on, where in your experience has the most resistance been coming from? Is it from government? Is it from communities? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a political thing? Maybe you could just kind of pinpoint problem areas.
Oh wow. Well, I don't know. I don't know, Brian. I think one of the things that makes it challenging is that it's a little bit of all of the above. I know when we talk about the science being settled, I think you guys are cycling enthusiasts. You guys are advocates. Every week there's like a paper. There's a new paper that comes out saying cycling is great. Yes, I mean it says the same thing as basically the last few hundred papers that came out on it. But I think the tricky part there really is trying to unwind a lot of maybe decisions that have been made over time that have kind of compounded into both a political system and maybe a mentality that a lot of people have, just because they maybe aren't exposed to a lot of the same information that we have. I mean, I'm not saying people are necessarily ignorant, but it's just that people sometimes, when you grow up hearing one set of messages and you've heard one set of viewpoints and messages, and maybe even you can even call it like when you've only had one sort of scientific and economic model for thinking about the world, it becomes very difficult to convince people otherwise, even if there is a mathematical explanation for what you're trying to do. So I think maybe, yeah, the big challenge really is trying to, I think, kind of like unwind, a lot of these decisions that compound on top of each other. It's the fact that maybe when you're on the road, cars take up most of your, they take up most of your field of vision. So that plays into thoughts people have about who is really the majority user of our road infrastructure. And then when you look at the legal system, from building codes to traffic laws, you do see, I mean, when you look at it through a critical eye, you see that there are all these little decisions that have been made over time that come together, and form the system that's really hard to uproot.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Right. So, you mentioned field of vision, no? Like people growing up with just seeing cars and yung normal before this pandemic, right? Now, what's interesting about Pasig City is you have these car-free Sundays in Emerald, right? Can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, is that something that could be expanded? What kind of data are you gathering, or lessons are you gathering from that?
Sure, yeah. The thing about the car-free days that we do in Pasig City. So I think the most visible one is in Emerald, but we do have 4 more locations all over Pasig. I don't know all the locations off the top of my head right now, but then it's been something that the transport and environment departments have been doing over a long period of time. So it's quite interesting when you try to collect data about them, because when you actually get an opinion poll of what people think about the car-free days, the people who are usually most opposed to them are people who have been used to traveling through the area, and then suddenly have to suddenly they have to like turn their brains on from trying to do. Well, I'm not saying that they, it's more like when you used to travel unconsciously through an area, and then suddenly you see that the street is closed, it becomes very annoying, right? So suddenly you have to make new conscious decisions and effort when trying to travel through a place. And I think people who are traveling through a street that was made car-free on Sunday, these people usually tend to be the most opposed. But when you poll people that live along the streets or in the vicinity of the streets made car-free, I know a lot of them actually really love it, and many of them actually, some people even ask us if can make the streets car-free on other days like Saturdays, or even if you could make portions of the street permanently car-free, like if you take one lane or like half the street and just turn it into additional public space. We've gotten some people that have shared that opinion with us.
Yeah, and to be
Yeah.
honest, like a lot of us know people, even our friends, who na dumadayo pa to Pasig City just to go to that car-free area.
Oh yeah.
Sure.
Can I just say, it's so fun there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like andun yung bancheto, you can like eat, can hang out, I brought my family there. Tapos we just, hang out lang, sobrang chill.
Yeah.
So you can also teach your friends to bike, learn how to,
Yeah.
sobrang fun.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you guys more. We actually learned quite a bit about another car-free day which we had. We trialed a car-free day on Pearl Drive, basically, which is in front of which is another part of Pasig near University of Asia in the Pacific, and that was quite an interesting learning experience for us because the first day in which we had that car-free day was a Friday. So we were quite interested to find out what the traffic would look like on the Friday night. It was like pre-ECQ Friday night, so we're all looking forward to like awful traffic. But then one thing we found is that the theory a lot of people have when you shut off a street is that, oh, won't that lead to a traffic overflow on other streets? And this is conventional wisdom, but then in transport studies, we know that it's not always that simple. I mean, it's not traffic isn't quite it doesn't behave the same way as a liquid. Basically, it doesn't necessarily overflow, and we did see that despite closing a street on a Friday, there wasn't much traffic overflow. There wasn't much congestion caused on other streets, and I think that was a really important finding that we had. Another interesting thing we found when we had that car-free street on Pearl Drive was that you had a lot of kids coming out to play, a lot of kids actually riding bikes for the first time. There were many parents of kids who were telling us that, oh wow, it was so happy for them to be able to ride their bike on the street, because I think many of these kids had only been riding their bikes inside the condos.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great for them to finally get out into the sun. And we also noticed actually that we learned a little bit about public space and especially the value of shade, because there's a construction site on one side of Pearl Drive, right? And they had this scaffolding set up where there was like some netting on the top to catch falling rocks. And even though it's a construction site, we found that actually a lot of the kids like to run and play there because the netting provided a shade that made things a little more comfortable for them. And I think that taught us a little bit about how even if we can't plant tree-lined streets overnight, there are other ways of making our streets more walkable, maybe with temporary materials. And so this is something which we are maybe looking for. We're looking for ways to maybe take some of that, maybe some of what we've learned about temporary shading and using that to improve sidewalks. So doing little trials like that gives you a lot of information.
How about
So we have a question that's kind of related on the site. Caleb Jacinto asks, has Pasig City's comprehensive land use plan been updated to incorporate cycling-friendly infrastructure?
So it's actually the CLUP is going through an update process now, and we'll definitely have input on that. I think one thing which we want to formalize as part of our planning documents and guidelines going forward is to make cycling really a valid and viable mode of transportation. Many people are under the impression, again, going back to that compounded belief system, that many people are under the impression that cycling is not a mode of transport for the Philippines, that it's inherently unviable because it's too hot. So we take inspiration from cities like Singapore and Taipei recently, whose planning documents in recent years really recognize the role of cycling, and we want to take cues from that in developing Pasig's formal policies as well.
I actually always say that our climate is actually pretty friendly compared to some other countries' climates where you could be freezing, you could be
Yeah.
dying from heat stroke. The temperature range is pretty small here and pretty
Yeah.
predictable. Yeah, so
Absolutely. One thing which I want to share, maybe not many people are aware of this, but then when you look at cycling numbers in cities like London and New York, most of the year, those cities are like cool. They've got winters, they're temperate, but they have summers that are just as hot and humid as Manila. But in the summer in those cities, that's when their cycling numbers are the highest. So it's quite interesting, when it gets really hot, when it gets as hot as the Philippines, that's when you see the cyclists really come out. It's not necessarily a deterrent, a real deterrent to cycling.
actually hotter in some countries, and humidity is actually it's actually both good and bad in a sense, because if you're in a low humidity country, you tend to be a little bit comfortable, and then you forget that you're getting dehydrated without
Yeah, yeah,
even kind of
sure. Yep. Okay.
Okay. How about the Pasig bike share? One of your other initiatives that, of course, we
yeah.
in the
Yeah.
past, I think 1 or 2 years now.
Sure. Yeah, I think with bike share, this is a project that our department also inherited in the transition from the environment office to becoming an independent office. One thing which we've basically found to be a challenge in operating our own bike share system is that I think it's sort of like a bike lane, really. Like, it looks simple on the outside and there's a low capital cost, but then you do have to put a lot of investment into the back end of it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of operational systems, in terms of setting up things like payment schemes and user registrations, and even tracking the bikes that are used for the project. So we've had some experience operating it the last few years. We've had to kind of limit the rollout because of just to work out all of the operational glitches in the system. But one thing which we're working on is we're trying to work with local partners to maybe transition to migrate the system towards a 100% 100% like Philippine operated system, basically, so that we can have local support for we can have local support for the system.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
how many bikes do you have in total? Like,
So with the Pasig bike share system, we have 10 stations and about 100 bikes total. It's not a very large amount, but we are, once we have completed a system migration, then we're going to look into possibly expanding it.
is it working out? How many users do you usually have in certain periods of time?
Yeah, so basically, when it comes to users, we don't have the hugest user base at the moment, but we do get a couple of hundred, sometimes like over 1,000 users in a month. It's
Wow.
mostly, yeah, for the most part, the bikes are concentrated in the CBD. So a lot of people who use it are people using it for things like doing errands, for going to lunch, going to the office, in and around the CBD locations.
Right. That's I don't know. Even if you said na parang medyo played it na 1,000 lang.
Yeah.
To me that's a lot. Like that could be at most 1,000 cars, no?
Exactly. Yeah.
I have friends, I won't say who they are, but I have friends who have to drive from Barangay San Antonio, Shaw Boulevard to Emerald. Like they
Yeah.
do
I mean,
every day and it takes them 45 minutes to an hour.
yeah.
So
Imagine that, right?
yeah, so there's really a lot of potential in this bike share
Sure.
program. But of course, it relies on a bike lane network now that you also have. Can you
Yeah.
bit more about that as well?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing about the bike lane network, like I said, it doesn't look like much when you look at the materials involved, when you look at the peso cost of deploying everything. But the challenge in deploying a bike lane network, again, is working through the political acceptability and convincing all the stakeholders that this is not going to destroy the economy. It's actually good for the city in a lot of ways, and it will be nice, to basically get everybody connected. The philosophy we have when it comes to expanding the bike lane network is that we are working on setting up the priority protected lanes on the streets which are most currently dominated by motor vehicle traffic. So our targets for protected lanes are really the sections of the national roads within Pasig, like C5, Ortigas, and Pasig Boulevard. these roads tend to be the ones where cars are going the fastest and where car volumes are highest. We're also looking at the most, I guess, car-dominated local roads like Meralco Avenue, just to make sure that bikers can have a good cycling experience, even with motor vehicles. So we're prioritizing those also because these roads tend to have the I guess the greatest lateral road right of way. So there's actually space to put bike lane barriers without really reducing the number of lanes too much. I mean, we know naman that reducing lanes doesn't necessarily lead to an increase in congestion over the whole network. But then it always makes the arguments easier when you talk to people and say, look, we're not even taking that many lanes off the road. I mean, you still have to use language that people understand sometimes.
Well, speaking of bike lanes, we have one viewer who asked a question in the comment section. Sabi niya, can anonymous citizens of Pasig put up bollards in their areas to make DIY bike lanes? Asking for a friend.
For a friend.
Well, what I will tell your friend is that while I think there's a lot to be said now, I think you guys are familiar with the movement known as tactical urbanism, right? Where
Yeah.
I think where people who decide to use their own like low cost materials to make their own improvements to the street. Now, I think if people did that though, officially the government might be constrained to I guess like evaluate whatever you put on the street. I think in most cases it might be legally considered obstructing the street. I think there's got to be some kind of violation for that. But then what we've also been working on really is developing a framework for if we want to create something like a tactical urbanism framework where if a resident of Pasig came to our office, gave us a proposal and showed us that they would entirely self-fund it, where we would like we would like to have a framework where we can receive proposals like that and just approve them. And if the city's okay with it, if your community is okay with it, and you've already done the hard work of raising the money and convincing your neighbors, I don't see why cities shouldn't entertain proposals like that.
That makes sense, no? Kasi in the whole conversation of like bike lanes, one thing that's you also mentioned earlier is that we want people who create the policies and who design these bike lanes to actually be biking. And what better way, to put them in place than to help to have people who live within those areas tell you and submit their ideas about how to make it work for their community.
Sure, yeah. I think that's an interesting. That's something we've been looking at for a while. I think the tactical urbanism movement. It doesn't always work within the. It doesn't always work within the legal boundaries of various city and national governments. But I think there's a lot of lessons there that we can learn, and a lot of good things there that maybe it would be good for a city like Pasig to support also. So we're very open to having conversations like that.
Great.
There's another question from Joven Roy Santiago. So parang what do you think about LGUs piloting public showers? I mean, in the city to encourage people to cycle to work, especially those who work for employers who do not have these facilities. Kasi alam ko like, ang daming buildings, so parang hindi naman sila inisip na magkaroon ng showers, for example. When they thought about, putting up galagyan ng CR, walang shower. So, now na kunwari, marami na nagbabike, hindi na kayang magdagdag ng shower facilities. So, parang dito yung context niya ng public access na for showers and probably lockers also. Parang meron na pag-isipan na rin ba ng Pasig, for example.
Yeah, I think the thing about showers kasi is that they're compared to other forms of infrastructure, they're a little more expensive. So I think it's always challenging because while showers would be nice to have everywhere, you're right. Not all buildings have them. Not all buildings have them in the numbers required to support a very high percentage of cyclists. And it would be nice to have them, I think. And we're definitely looking maybe at putting up more showers in the future. We're also looking at an incentive framework to allow buildings to make showers available to cyclists, and maybe support that through various, maybe even financial incentives from the city. But I think from our perspective, naman, our office is really focused more on, I guess, the lower hanging fruit of bicycle policy, and that's really a safe bike lane network, low speed limits, and abundant parking. But definitely, showers can, the availability of showers can also uh, maybe stimulate and incentivize another part of the population to bike. So it's something where if there are creative ideas, if we came across a way to make showers available at a low enough cost so that it's economic, I mean, why not, right? Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about what you've done before the pandemic, and now I think we can start talking about what the Pasig Transport has done during the pandemic. And I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
one thing I remember is you converted the bike share bikes into, you lent them to people. Am I right?
Yeah, well, I think maybe when you talk about what's happened during the pandemic, I always feel like it's important, when talking about the travel disruption under enhanced community quarantine. I think it's really important for people to appreciate how, just how important it is that transport demands are still met. I think one thing that we all have to realize under enhanced community quarantine is that the majority of people in the areas subject to ECQ have been experiencing, moderate to severe travel disruptions. I think it goes without saying that when you pull out a public transportation system overnight, that people will attempt to adapt, but not everyone can adapt at the same speed and to the same degree. So it becomes really difficult for a lot of people to cope with this. And we've seen this in stories of people having to walk, for hours, for 5, 10 kilometers, which is well further than I think what many people would consider a comfortable walking commute. So I think it's in this context really that our operations under enhanced community quarantine have really been with I guess, the goal of using all available resources to make sure that travel disruptions are mitigated. So, we took basically the 100 bikes of the Pasig bike share system, and we've temporarily stopped the operations of the bike share system and made the bikes available to people working in various positions of the city government. So we know that the people working on the front lines aren't necessarily just the people in the hospitals and in the intensive care units, but it's also people like working in security, working to provide things like government financial and procurement services. It's also people keeping various parts of the city government open. So we basically just taken our bike share bikes and turned them into service vehicles for staff that still have to keep coming to work. We've also done some additional purchasing of bikes. So we bought about 88 more bikes to give out to basically issue to more people working on the front lines. But so even if we've basically distributed more than 200 bikes, so this combination of the bike share bikes, bikes that we bought, and bikes which were very generously donated to the city, I want to shout out the organization Life Cycles Philippines.
Yeah.
They've been organizing donations of bicycles to frontliners in various organizations, and they've been a big help to Pasig City as well. But like I said, even if we've given more than 200 bikes out, we still have a backlog of, I think, more than 300 requests. I think there are still many people who are still experiencing severe disruption in their commutes who've indicated that a bicycle would make it quite easier.
So all 100 bikes are out there. What kind of feedback have you had? Have you had any feedback coming from the people who've been using those bikes?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, I think this is something that I've found when it comes to bike commuting, even before ECQ. I think for a lot of people, once you get them started on bicycle commuting, I think they find that it's a lot easier than they thought it would be. It's a lot more fun than they thought it would be, and it's a lot less exhausting and maybe difficult than they thought it would be. So I think out of all the people that have been given bikes, I think I'm quite confident that many of them will become permanent or regular bike commuters. One of the requirements we have in the city when it comes to issuing people bikes is that they have to use the bikes to commute at least 3 times a week. So
Oh.
this makes sure that the bikes are being utilized, and also that the employee is responsible for keeping the bikes in a good working order. So we will be having check-ins with the people issued bikes, and if they are continuing to use them and keeping them in good running condition, then we're totally fine with that. But we definitely want to. We've definitely also gotten comments that in the recent days we've seen motor vehicle traffic sort of tick up again. It's ticked up a bit, but jams have not quite returned. So the vehicles that are on the road are going quite a bit faster than they would under pre-CQ conditions. So I think that creates slightly more stressful conditions for cyclists, and we'd like to remedy that using some of the temporary solutions that we talked about earlier.
That's ironic nga kasi nung pre-ECQ, you could comfortably like filter through cars, and like one thing we would tell our friends is it's okay, like biking is actually pretty, it's not as scary because the cars aren't moving. And now that we're in ECQ, cars that people who are able to drive are driving at much faster speeds. And I think just this morning I saw one post where the Philippine Red Cross had to help out one cyclist
Oh no.
who was who met an accident with a motorcycle. So of course these new challenges still do come, but it's good to know na meron minimum usage requirement na three thrice a
Yeah,
week.
yeah. Definitely. I mean, yeah, you always want to get the most out of anything that public funds are being invested in. So we wanted to make sure that at least there was that, and at least the bikes we use will continue to be used for everyday transportation.
Okay. Now, one thing that also was reported in the news and you announced recently was, I'm just gonna read this. It's quite long. A resolution enabling cycling as a means of transportation for people making essential travel during the 2020 period of enhanced community quarantine over the
Yeah.
entire Luzon and for other purposes.
Yeah.
Whose initiative was this? Was this something that you worked on?
Well, I think it was a nice initiative of the Pasig City Council, really, and one of the one of the main effects of this resolution was really the declaration that cycling is an essential mode of transportation, and since cycling does support a lot of essential frontline travel, I mean, like I said earlier, many people like nurses and doctors who used to be able to take public transport now have to bike to work, and it's with the same reasoning that if people are allowed to drive to work, it seems logical that the businesses that support driving, like gas stations, should be allowed to remain open to enable that essential travel to continue. So one of the things we thought about was that with all these people that are cycling to work, shouldn't we allow the bike shops that provide bikes, spare parts, and essential maintenance? Shouldn't we allow these shops to open to support that kind of travel? I mean, it would only be beneficial to frontliners if we allow those businesses to open, and that's exactly what we were able to enable recently.
Now, this talks more about travel during 2020 period of ECQ, right? Is there something that's on the pipeline for after the ECQ?
Yeah, certainly. I think one thing that we've seen during ECQ is that with cycling recognized as an essential form of transportation, I think it would be more than foolish for any government in the world to I guess walk back any gains when it comes to supporting cycling at this time. Cycling is really bailing out a lot of the services that have experienced travel disruption recently. So I think it's important to make sure that if we get to the point where we need to have additional lockdowns or additional quarantines, especially as some experts say, in case there's another wave of COVID-19 or any other pandemic, then you want to have a good system for cycling, and you want to have guidelines that enable cycling in place to be able to minimize travel disruption and make sure that your essential frontliners are still able to work.
Okay. So now let's go back a bit to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
How will we end this ban on public transport? How exactly is the Pasig LGU working on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's when you talk naman about this ban on public transportation, I think the thing about transportation is that it's a the systems are so interdependent. I mean, the reason there's such a high demand for cycling now is precisely because of the ban of on public transportation, and I think everyone's talking about how to get public transport working again and what conditions you can operate it safely under. I think for us, we're already thinking about what it'll look like after ECQ because it's something we see as very important. I think there are three main considerations that we need to consider when talking about public transport after ECQ. I think number one, we need to have a look at vehicles to enable safety of the drivers. So a lot of people, when you talk about public transport under COVID, many people talk about things like lowered loading for social distancing. Now that's important, but in the cities that have continued to operate public transport, that have not been able to put in very stringent protections, we see that I think there's some cities in the states where the transit workers are dying at rates that are similarly high to health workers. So it's very important to protect transit workers from being infected with COVID-19 and other viruses in a pandemic. So I think that involves retrofitting the vehicles and making sure that you have good disinfection procedures. I think in Shenzhen, actually, in China, one of the best practices they have there is that everyone who rides the bus has to have a mask. If you don't have a mask, you get given one when you board the bus. And during lunch breaks, the drivers in the bus company aren't even allowed to talk to each other and sit next to each other to prevent them from possibly infecting each other if they're carriers. So I think we need to think about regulations that are that detailed in order to operate public transport safely. Second thing we need to consider is going cashless. Cash is a potential vector for virus transmission. You can't really practically disinfect it. So I think going cashless has to be on the agenda of any public transport operator right now. And we're looking for ways to enable this for tricycles in Pasig. And the last thing we need to consider really is making sure that there's enough financial support for public transport operations so that you can operate at a high level even with reduced loading. The one of the unfortunate feedback loops in our public transport system in the Philippines is that the drivers are incentivized to load the vehicle and indeed overload buses and jeepneys because how much money they make is directly tied to how many passengers they're carrying. We need to have systems where the driver is able to feed his family even if he only loads the vehicle at 30 to 50%, just
Right.
to make sure that you have consistent social distance loading of these vehicles. And I think we have to have conversations about how much support the government can give to operators in order to make these guidelines a reality.
Given the current trajectory of the pandemic and also all these things that we need to work on and prepare before putting public transport on the green light again, how much time do you need would it take, or when would we be possibly ready to actually resume public transport?
Well, I can't really say for certain how much time it'll take. I think maybe agencies like the Department of Transportation might be in a better position to talk about how far along we are in terms of affecting some of the things I talked about. But I think definitely we'll have to, if we are to lift ECQ and operate public transport safely again, I think we have to have good answers to the concerns in each of those three issues that I just talked about now. So, I mean, I guess maybe, it's a bit of an unsatisfying answer in that I can't really say for sure, but I think it's definitely a prerequisite.
No, it's okay. We also don't want you to commit naman to, diba? You're also representing Pasig City here and biglang mamaya people will start complaining. Sabi ni Anton, bakit
Yeah.
That's also understandable because everything's so uncertain talaga eh. I mean, you don't know what's gonna happen, how long it's gonna take, diba?
Yeah.
I'm trying to imagine it kasi parang, especially, I mean, in the parts of Pasig that I've been to, there are a lot of small streets, diba? And people jeepneys and motor tricycles. And I feel like it's really it's going to be a big challenge to let people go about that daily habit of commuting while still maintaining social distancing. And I think that's where cycling is really going to be important.
Absolutely. And I think maybe the thing about public transportation in the Philippines is that whether you like it or not, I think maybe a lot of people won't, a lot of people maybe are not, there are going to be mixed feelings about this. But I think after ECQ, there's no acceptable way to go back to conditions that we had before. I think in Pasig City, sometimes I think it's become part of life to see tricycles loaded with like 7 or even 8 people, and 6 to 8 people basically, just because of the high demand density in some areas. I think maybe we're going to have to do a lot harder work in the government to make sure that the tricycles don't have to operate in that way just to be viable. I think we definitely have to do a lot of work reimagining what our public transport system will look like.
Right. So we talked about before the ECQ. We've talked about during the ECQ. So parang now naman, parang we want to know like what are your thoughts or maybe your dreams about making transportation in Pasig more inclusive. But before that, parang I want to share lang a question from Karen Crisostomo. Hi Karen.
Hello,
Um,
yeah.
so she asked like, do you think the people who are loaned bikes will continue to bike even when the lockdown is lifted na, and public transport is made available? So yeah, what do you think
Yeah,
about that?
well, I think maybe it might be a little too much to expect that everyone will continue to bike afterwards. But I think certainly a non-zero portion will continue to bike. I think you guys know that many people do find it to be a lot of fun once you start bike commuting. So I think I'm confident that a good number will continue to bike even after ECQ is lifted. And we want to make sure that even after ECQ, they're still able to have like a good cycling experience, and that's why we're working on deploying things like tactical bike lanes, even during the quarantine period, just to make sure that people have good infrastructure to cycle on.
Tactical bike lanes, like, can you tell us more about it? Parang
Oh yeah, well,
second again.
yeah. Well, this is just what I was talking about earlier when I said that the MMDA lent us a bunch of plastic barriers. We're trying to identify areas where, like Jan mentioned earlier, are high risk areas for cyclists, especially with high motor vehicle traffic. And we want to make sure, in recognition of the fact that a lot of cyclists are essential frontline workers, that we don't lose any of them to motor vehicle crashes. So we want to make sure that we know where these high risk areas are, and we can deploy some immediate protection for them.
So parang I remember lang like 2 weeks ago we were talking with Keisha, and then like she mentioned na parang now na maraming bike share programs, and then like we're thinking of like ideas, for example, setting up temporary bike lanes or emergency bike lanes. And then after that, after na malift yung lockdown, these temporary bike lanes making permanent bike lanes. Do
Yeah.
you think it's possible, or
I think it's absolutely possible, and I think maybe even if some bike lanes are designated temporary now, I'm sure there will be strong cases made to make them permanent in the future. I think that definitely after COVID-19, we are probably not going to see a return to pre-ECQ levels of motor vehicle traffic for the near future. I think it'll be a long time before all the businesses that used to be open will be open again, and I think. Uh, Especially when it comes to rush hours and travel behavior, it's going to be a long time before we can take high motor vehicle traffic as a given. And even if we took like high demand for motor vehicle use and driving as a given, I think it would be a complete mistake to plan our cities around that after ECQ, after seeing the powerful contingency that a good cycling network and a good uh, cycling program can be for cities.
right? So I think you're right, no? Like after the lockdown, kahit na bumalik sa normal, parang it's gonna be a bit different. in a way.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, Pasig Transport, your team, parang nagpa-plan na rin ba kayo ng like cycling related projects or program
Sure. Yeah.
after? Um, parang I was thinking like personally kung may kasi correct, for example, may momentum na parang ang dami na nagbabikes, ganon. Parang is there something like a program to support or to keep the momentum going or to
Yeah.
like more, like meron bang mga ideas? Can you share us
Absolutely.
more?
Yeah, I think definitely after the lockdown, one thing we are certainly committed to doing is to make sure that all of our streets can enable safe and comfortable and stress-free cycling. I think because of the lockdown, we have a strong argument to because of many things related to cycling during EZQ. I think there's a strong argument to dedicate much more road space than we have now to cycling and even to more, even as more walking space. I think definitely we have to look at many more of our roads and really have an honest discussion about whether we are providing enough for people that are commuting by walking or cycling. We also intend to continue our program to expand bicycle parking in Pasig City. We are currently working on revising the policies on requiring bike parking, and we're working to procure a lot more bicycle parking facilities like bike racks, especially in government buildings and public areas.
I think that when we talk about cycling as a positive thing for a city, I think we're all in agreement about it. But do you get a sense that there might be a willingness or even commitment on the part of stakeholders to pursue it, even if it comes at the cost of space and other things that would have to be committed to this particular cause? Because it's easy to say we want more bikes, but
Yeah.
do we still want the bikes if it comes at the cost of what people perceive to be problematic costs? But obviously, if you actually look at studies, it's not true. But that's the
Yeah, right.
perception, diba? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what cycling advocates have to do now, and I consider myself one really, even though I still work for the government. But I think my opinion on cycling advocacy post COVID-19 is I think the number one thing which advocates shouldn't waste is all of the great uh, arguments that can be substantiated by looking out your window right now. I think the ECQ lockdown has given us a wealth of images that we can point to and say, look, we didn't actually need all this space for cars to run essential businesses. But clearly, we need to have better provision for bicycles because that's how people are still getting around. I think the important thing for advocates to do is to really show that the trade off in terms of space isn't the high cost that we believe it to be. And in fact, I think we've got to do, I think the field of cycling advocacy has really got to, I guess, maybe step up in a way, using all of this, all of the images that are available to us right now that are being given to us during the lockdown. I mean, we can't, we can't, we basically have to make it clear that going back to normal isn't something acceptable anymore, and it's not something that's going to it's not something that's going to help us when we have another pandemic like this.
Being an insider in government, do you have optimism about this? Do you feel like I don't know, your
I think,
collaborators? Yeah.
well, I think I have to. I think Brian, maybe I might be the wrong person to ask about that because when you are a transport planner, I think this is a field that self-selects for optimists. When you when you're transforming a transport system, I think there's no way to do that unless you naturally have a vision of the future that's better than what we have today. I wouldn't be in this job without it. So if you ask me whether I'm optimistic or not, I think there's always there are always opportunities to win more battles and to make things better. And I think especially with COVID, I'm not going to say it's a silver lining. Certainly, this situation we're in is still quite serious. There's still a lot of people that are they're facing great difficulties because of everything we're going through. But I think maybe for cycling advocates, we've got to latch onto this and make sure that people recognize cycling for being the essential mode of transportation that it is, and that it's really bailing out a lot of people right now.
A lot of people actually overlook the fact that cycling-friendly countries, they don't come in nature. They're actually produced and
Absolutely.
hard fought, hard won
Yeah.
actually for many of these countries.
Oh yeah.
We're really glad you're doing such things in Pasig.
Oh yeah, well, we're super happy. I mean that we're happy that there we can have hangouts like this, and that we can keep the culture going, keep the discussion going. And I think in the coming months especially, it's we're going to need all the help we can get from the public, from the people who don't work in government, to make sure that these arguments are carried through.
Yes, certainly. And speaking of the public, I'll bring up some questions that were unanswered in the comments. So King Francis Ocampo asks, question, what's your sense on national government giving priorities to biking or walking post ECQ or in the new normal scenario? So what do you think, like, national government thinks? I don't know.
I don't know. I can't really speak directly for the national government. I do know that in Congress there have been advocates supportive of sustainable transport. I know that there's a draft bill prepared by the guys at Mobility Philippines called the Magna Carta for Commuters that makes really sustainable transport like walking and cycling as central parts of transport policy going forward. I mean, that's what the bill wants to do. So I think maybe it's a matter of making sure that the technical people, there are many good technical people in national government, and unfortunately, the reality of working in government is that, for political reasons, like we discussed earlier, the logical, scientific arguments don't always get the most amplification. But I think I think maybe the people who have advocated for the Magna Carta for commuters and the lawmakers and officials that have championed it in both the legislative and executive branches should really, I think this is a great opportunity for them to highlight the arguments they've already made. So I think at the national level, there's definitely room for improvement, but I think there will be some new momentum that can carry some of those arguments through.
Okay. So Caleb Jacinto asks, what are your thoughts on electric scooters?
Oh yeah. Well, actually, one thing which I also tell people is that I actually commuted with an electric scooter for a couple of months, almost a year. I started out on a bike in 2017. Then I went to traveling on an electric scooter for a while, and actually, my wife still uses one every day. Of course, now that she works at home a lot of the time, she doesn't get to use it anymore. But biking and using light electric transport is a big part of our lives, and I think it's something which the government should support a lot more going forward. Light electric vehicles are, they're incredibly energy efficient. They're good for the environment. They don't. They're really good when it comes to transportation that maintains good levels of air quality. And I think the cities that are the most progressive in the world are doing some good stuff to enable people to choose light electric transport over, let's say, buying a car. So I think that's a good framework for how we should approach them going forward.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so this one was already answered. Marco Gomez's question was already answered before. I think the last one is from Omi Castañar.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Rob, are you exploring on doing anything about the supply of private parking spaces in commercial areas in order to decrease demand for vehicles and increase demand for bicycles?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, we are reviewing the Pasig requirements for bicycle parking. Actually, in Pasig has a local ordinance that requires all buildings to have bicycle parking. But one thing which we want to work on, which we had been working on pre-ECQ, is rolling out, implementing rules and regulations that specify a compliance requirement. You can't just put up one rusty bike rack in a shopping mall and say that you've complied. We want to make sure that that whenever you have a development in Pasig, that a percentage of the built parking space is made available as parking space for bikes, because we want to make sure that bike parking is not just available but also available in a decent manner. I think anyone who's cycled to commute before, it's always a nightmare when you have a nice bike and you have to throw it on a pile of like 20 other bikes, and then
Yeah.
it's scratched, and then your brake rotor get bent, and it's not a good experience. So we want to make sure that even parking your bike is going to be a decent experience in Pasig.
It doesn't even have to be a fancy bike. If you love your bike.
If you love your bike, right, you want to take care of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I personally have follow-up questions like based on
Sure.
the past
Yeah.
questions. You also mentioned like earlier in the discussion about people bringing up plans like for LGUs to maybe approve. So how do you think, like for example, if there's this one person or a group of people like, oh, they want to propose certain things that they want their LGUs to accomplish, like in terms of transpo, like how can they go about it? Like what's the first thing they need to do? What
Can they just tweet it at you?
or
Yeah.
is
Like
it
every day.
or write a letter or something?
Well, I'll be very honest with you guys. The part of the challenge of working in government is that everyone has I'm not going to say that public opinion is a bad thing, or like people expressing their opinions about projects to government is a bad thing. But the best way in which you can make a proposal happen with government, to be completely honest, is if you can come to government in a way that minimizes the staff work required. So, I mean, if you come to government with a proposal that requires somebody in government to dedicate a lot of staff time, a lot of staff energy, a lot of staff even emotional capacity to deal with the stress of like talking to all these people and breaking all of these political deadlocks, then it's not going to be something that's going to be easy for government to roll out. Which is why when it comes to things like tactical urbanism, I think there's a good potential there for, let's say, if you can come to government with a project like you want to put up your own, let's say, small intersection improvement, and you already have the traffic cones, you already have the paint, you have people who are willing to work for you, and you just want the government to say yes and not pull your cones out. So I think there's an opportunity for projects like that, and I think it's good for governments to have a framework for things like that, because if we can encourage people who are willing to improve their communities in their own way, and then support those projects with the government investment going forward, because in a way they can become kind of like test cases for further government investment. Then I think those sorts of projects, those sorts of proposals, where it becomes more of a partnership as opposed to kind of just tweeting a wish list at government, then I think that stuff can get has good potential for being supported.
I'm starting a GoFundMe na for Joa. Get bike lane paint.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the other thing that makes it easy for government is if people, of course, not saying that we don't want, of course, to encourage people to take money out of their own pockets and provide services that government should be already in charge of. But one thing that really makes it easier for workers in government is if with your proposal you've already organized people politically. If people participate instead of just like you can air your sentiments, but then one thing that really helps us is that if you really want a bike lane in your neighborhood, if you can be the one to, let's say, talk to your neighbors and get everyone to agree and help government out when it comes to building that consensus. I think that's where at least for people in government who want to do the right thing, it's really a big help to us for people to do that.
All right. There was a question that just came in now from Prince Magtulis. In terms of local government budgeting, does the shift to more sustainable transport also
Is it also sustainable?
sustainable financially for LGUs? I'm assuming it
Yeah.
works like e-money for banks where large investments are needed upfront before earnings accrue through the years. Or am I wrong? Consider also those who may get affected, such as PUVs. Would they need cash aid at the start of the shift?
Well, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. There's again, like we were talking about earlier, there is a wealth of science that demonstrates the overwhelming economic benefits of investing in sustainable transport infrastructure. I think if you have a lane that's mixed traffic that's used mostly for motor vehicles, when you put in together the economic cost of congestion, of air pollution, and of maintenance, it ends up becoming a continuing economic and financial drain. But if you convert that same area of road into like a bike lane or sidewalk or a mix of both, then it actually saves the community money economically because of all the benefits it has for the city, and even financially. Sustainable transport infrastructure tends to be much lower cost than building infrastructure for motor vehicles. But when it comes to things like investing to ensure a consistently high level of service from public transport, when you talk about government having to take responsibility for service levels and putting money out so that the financial risk isn't on the private sector. It does cost money, and it requires a continually replenished fund to sustain public transport operations. But I think the other good thing about that is that there is also again a wealth of science that justifies that shows that government investment in subsidizing a high level of public transport provision is quite economical and ends up paying the community back, many times over.
Okay. And I have a like I want to get your opinion on this because um I think a week ago when the Starbucks photo came out, I remember seeing a tweet saying that like, oh, it's okay that people are in cars because there's social distancing naman eh. So what can you say about that? Because right, like you were saying earlier that like advocacy is very important, so we have to like shift minds of like people who have a very
Yeah.
car centric mindset. So if people think that like being in cars is like social distancing, so what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think the thing about that argument really is that you have to appreciate it not just in terms of the people inside the vehicles, but then if you extend the logic of that argument, what does it mean for the rest of the city? And what we can see really is that why are trains so crowded? Why are buses so crowded? Why are even things like sidewalks and public markets so crowded? It's really because we have so much urban land taken over by cars, by the space, between driver and the car doors, and even by infrastructure that's dedicated to cars and which can only be safely used by cars. That the remaining space for non-car travel ends up becoming so crowded. So I think that's something which that's a point which has to come across clearly. That yes, people inside a car can social distance, but then if you center all of your policy around enabling social distancing in cars, then you take away the ability of everybody else to physically distance. And I don't think any policymaker should see that as an acceptable outcome.
That's right.
Actually, in the context of COVID-19, they're now investigating the correlation between particulates in the air and severity of symptoms.
Yeah.
So the congestion that we've been experiencing might actually have made it worse for us, facing a pandemic and future ones in the future as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also an important point to make that air pollution actually kills so many people every year. And again, this is not a silver lining that I'm talking about, but there are already papers coming out to show that the reduction in air pollution from reduced economic activity during COVID-19, the number of lives saved from that might actually be higher than all the people actually dying from the disease. Now, this is not to say that COVID-19 is a good thing. I'm not about to go thank you coronavirus or anything like that. But then I think it's important to show that the normal that we had pre-COVID-19 was not something, it wasn't the normal that we should have considered acceptable by any means. So And we know that we're starting to see more research about the sources of air pollution, and even in Euro 4 vehicles or even electric vehicles, there's a lot of air pollution that comes from what they call non-exhaust sources. So if you're driving a car, there might not be that much smoke coming out of your tailpipe, but there's a lot of particulate matter coming from your brake pads and coming from your tires, just because of the very heavy vehicles that everyone's using. And these particulates also make people put people at higher risk of dying from things like COVID-19. So I think what we have to see is that there's got to be a better way of communicating this data. There's got to be more conversations about the kind of choices we're making as far as transport.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so we have to wrap up this discussion, which was such a fruitful discussion. So thank you so much, Anton, for taking the time to
Yeah.
us finally had this discussion. And thank you to everyone who participated. You guys had really great questions. Thank you so much for contributing to the discussion. So
Okay.
without further ado, subscribe to the Cycling Matters podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just search Cycling Matters on your favorite podcast platform while you're staying at home. So just put on some headphones and enjoy the discussion. And just to let you know, this live episode will be uploaded to our podcast platforms for easy future listening. Check it out there. You can catch more of Cycling Matters on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, or on our website at cyclingmatters.ph. So thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Cycling Matters podcast. Until then, if you have to ride and stay safe, Philippines. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Anton.
Happy
Bye.
weekend.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.